In April every year, we hear so many stories about passengers on the Titanic. We learn about their fates or sometimes their life after the disaster. For years we have looked at the Titanic from the perspective of the passengers, those who went out to buy a ticket on the ship and sailed on it, not knowing the perils that would face them. This year, in these episodes about the Titanic, I want to take us on a different journey, to look at the Titanic from the perspective of the officers and the crew of the Titanic, those who were in charge of saving those lives on that fateful night. This is Weird and Wonderful History. Welcome to Weird and Wonderful History. I am your host, Gabrielle McMaster. I am an author and historian. In these episodes, I take you through the weird and the wonderful stories that you may or may not have heard about, bringing you new and fun facts that you may never have known about. This is Weird and Wonderful History. In these episodes about the Titanic, I want to start looking at the story from the perspective of the officers. The officers are quite often overlooked in the story of the Titanic. We hear so many stories about third-class passengers, second class, and more often than not, first-class passengers. But what different angle and understanding of the disaster would it give us if we looked at the officers and what happened before, during and after Titanic set sail? This is what we're going to be delving into, and in this first episode we're going to look at those early stages before Titanic set sail. We are going to start looking at everything that went on behind the scenes in terms of the officers. So let's start. Before we begin any story about the Titanic, I feel it is always essential to have a brief look at Belfast at the time. Belfast at the time was a very complex place, and really we could give it a whole episode all to itself. In these first few minutes, I just want to briefly look at the context of Belfast and the shipyards, and alongside that, the very first launch of the Titanic in 1911. So Belfast at the time was very much coloured by Home Rule, and we were on the tipping point at that stage of a potential civil war. We know in hindsight, of course, that the outbreak of the First World War in 1914 did cease the civil war happening. The whole motto surrounding Home Rule at the time was Home Rule or Rome Rule. The shipyards became infested with this. The shipyards at the time were a place that was dominated by Protestantism. While some Catholics did work in the shipyards, they were treated very, very badly. And there was an instance where no home rule was written on the side of the Titanic. And this really shows you just how infested with this home rule crisis that the shipyards were. The shipyards became a very toxic place for Catholics, and a lot of them did not wish to work there. Protestantism was fully dominating Harland and Wolff and the shipyards, and it wasn't a safe place for Catholics to work. A lot of them were being injured, accidentally on purpose, by their Protestant colleagues, and some of them were even beaten up. This whole concept was hard to imagine for us today, that people would behave like that. However, as with anything in the past, it must be understood within the context itself. In Belfast at the time, a lot of people would be able to distinguish Protestants from Catholics simply by wearing a bowler hat. Protestants would have wore a lot of bowler hats, and still in Northern Ireland we would see this today, from orange men wearing bowler hats on the 12th of July. This is a tradition which has lasted for well over 100 years now. And it is so important to see not only where that started, but also how that affected people in Belfast at the time. The Home Rule crisis divided Belfast and Ireland in general at the time, but the sister ships of the Olympic and the Titanic, those launches actually brought people together. And when I was doing my master's research, one of my papers was on the Titanic launch in 1911 and looking at the high and low culture of the ceremonies for this launch. One of the things that I really picked up on was that even though the shipyards was very much dominated by sectarianism, these launches were celebrated by everyone, regardless of religion or class. This showed just how much this culture brought people together. And I think it's important to start the Titanic journey off on the 31st of May in 1911. This date marked when the hull of the Titanic was successfully released into the River Lagan. And this was a massive ceremony. There were 100,000 spectators, and newspapers at the time reported how it was just a mass of people clumped together. Every single place around the River Lagan was taken up by people. This was such a special occasion for Belfast. We had had the successful launch of the Olympic, and now we had her long-awaited sister ship. We had the sister ship that was going to be far more luxurious than anything we had seen before, not just in Ireland, but in the entire world. And for Belfast to have achieved that, in spite of the Home Rule crisis, it was an absolute amazing celebration. And that is what brought people together. That is what overcame the Home Rule crisis for just a few hours in May. Of course, the next celebration came when Titanic was leaving for Southampton. The 2nd of April 1912, less than a year later, saw Titanic leaving Belfast for the final time. At 8 p.m, Titanic sailed to Southampton, and once again we saw 100,000 spectators. Newspapers at the time reported cheering, handkerchiefs waving, and singing Rule Britannia. to celebrate this massive feat for Ireland. In spite of the crisis, we had created something so beautiful for the time. And it is hard not to acknowledge that. While we can't just push away the sectarianism and the context which happened, we have to acknowledge that alongside achieving something so luxurious. And to put these two side by side is important, because Belfast put aside its differences for this, for these ceremonies, for these amazing celebrations that had never happened before in Belfast. A lot of the time we are quite prone to seeing the Olympic as the first ship and the one that became the most important for Belfast. And that was not necessarily the case. The Olympic was celebrated on a huge scale, and so was the Titanic. The Olympic was celebrated as the first of its kind. The sister ship, the Titanic, was celebrated as the first luxurious and the most luxurious liner in the whole world. So a lot of the time we have this misconception that the Olympic was the only one celebrated. With the successful launch of the Titanic setting sail in April 1912, it is important to now start looking at who was on the ship at the time. At the time, we had the officers on board. The officers boarded the ship in Belfast alongside Thomas Andrews. This is where it starts to get a little bit complicated. We of course know that there was a captain, a chief officer, and 6 more officers alongside that. However, in the grand concept of things, the Titanic had ended up with, in its very short lifetime, 2 chief officers and approximately 7 officers. We are going to start looking into that a little bit more. So when the officers boarded the ship in Belfast, we had Captain E.J. Smith, we had Chief Officer William McMaster Murdoch, First Officer Charles Herbert Lightoller, Second Officer David Blair, Third Officer Pittman, Fourth Officer Boxall, Fifth Officer Lowe, and Sixth Officer Moody. Lowe and Moody were the 2 youngest officers at the time. This was Murdoch's first ever time being chief officer. This was something he had worked his way towards, and something that he was so passionate about getting. Alongside this, we have Lightoller's first time as first officer. Both of these men are remembered for being shifted out of their positions. This is what we're going to start looking at. Once the men got onto the Titanic in Belfast and set sail for Southampton, they spent a lot of the time trying to get used to the ship. Lightoller wrote in his memoirs that he spent a lot of the time walking around the corridors and trying to get used to the layout of the ship because of the sheer size of it. These men were going to be expected to do rounds on the ship and take care of passengers and the general workings of the ship. These men had to get used to all of the corridors, all of the ways to get around the ship. The men were expected to do rounds while on duty. They would finish their watch on the bridge and then they would do their rounds. Due to this, they had to understand the workings of the ship and all the different passageways on the Titanic. And even when they docked in Southampton on the 3rd of April 1912, a lot of the officers still did not fully know their way around the ship. This ship was on a completely different scale to anything they had seen before. And this is where we start to meet the first major issue that the officers face. Due to the Titanic having a sister ship, they thought that it would have been important to have as many crew as possible from the Olympic onto the Titanic. William McMaster Murdoch, at this time chief officer, he was already on the Olympic. He knew the layout of the ship, and although it was not as luxurious as the Titanic, it still had a similar layout and similar passageways. That in itself was essential. However, some people thought that just having William McMaster Murdoch was not enough. They felt they needed someone else of a higher authority on the Olympic to come on board on the Titanic. A few days before the 9th of April, a man came on board by the name of Henry Tingle Wilde. And for some of the officers at the time, in hindsight, if you had have said that name to them, they wouldn't have thought much of it. However, on the 9th of April 1912, one day before the Titanic set sail, Henry Tingle Wilde was signed on as chief officer of the Titanic. Previously holding the position of chief officer of the Olympic, the White Star Line thought that having Wilde's knowledge of the ship as chief officer would become important for the Titanic. By bringing him on board as chief officer, the whole Titanic ended up having an officer reshuffle. The junior officers at the time, which was 3rd officer down to 6th officer, did not have any change. So we still had Pitman, Boxall, Lowe and Moody as the junior officers. However, the entire senior officers ended up reshuffled one day before the maiden voyage was to take place. And this in and of itself would have so many repercussions even on the night of the sinking. And that is something we're going to be looking at in later episodes. However, at the minute, we have Henry Tingle Wilde, who has just been signed on as the chief officer of the Titanic. At the time, he did not overly know what he was there for, and once he found out, he felt extremely bad because he knew exactly what would take place. And he was well aware, due to his years of experience, that there would be ill feeling with the other officers. William McMaster Murdoch loses his position, his first and only ever position as chief officer. And one day before the maiden voyage, this would have hit him pretty hard. He would have been shocked and probably a little bit resentful. Now, all of the men were professionals and they did not let their feelings show overly much. And William McMaster Murdoch would have had to accept this with a stiff upper lip, if we want to use British terminology here. He would have had to accept this and immediately move his stuff out of the chief officer room and into first officer. So he was immediately demoted to Light-Oller's position. And what impact did this have on Light-Oller? Well, I'm sure you can imagine. he was eventually demoted as well. So at the time that William McMaster Murdoch was demoted from chief officer to first officer, Smith in turn told Lightoller he would no longer be first officer, and he would be demoted to second officer, which was David Blair's position. At this stage then, we come to the decision of what do we do with David Blair? Do we shove Pittman off then and demote Blair down to third officer, which would then end up with everyone else demoted, and Moody would eventually have to leave the ship then because we don't have seventh officers? Or do we get rid of Blair? The decision came to get rid of David Blair. And David Blair was asked to pack up his stuff and leave the Titanic, with the promise, of course, that he would be placed on another ship. Blair did not really have ill feeling at the time. He accepted what his fate was. As we now know, due to the disaster taking place, this ultimately saved Blair's life. Blair left the Titanic, and everyone was then moved into the positions that they would be in for the maiden voyage. However, David Blair leaving did have repercussions for the sinking. When David Blair left, he was in charge of the binocular cabinet, and he had the key for the cabinet in his pocket. So when it came to needing the binoculars, there was no key to get into them, and therefore the lookouts and the officers were without their binoculars. As we know, if they had have spotted the iceberg earlier, the Titanic probably would have survived. This is probably one of the biggest impacts for the Titanic with the officer reshuffle. And it is hard not to see this as one of the causes for the sinking. As a historian, you really do have to look into the depth of what exactly took place for this to end up happening. And looking at the passengers is brilliant. It gives us a human insight into the disaster. But it does not give us an understanding of the impact of situations which led to the sinking happening. The only way to get such an insight is to look at those in charge, those in places of authority that allow us to see what went wrong. And this is one of the first things that we see going wrong. The Titanic are effectively without their binoculars due to the fact that David Blair left the Titanic with that key in his pocket. It is suggested that Lightoller held some sense of resentment, especially on the night of the sinking. And this was, of course, towards Wilde. We will look into that a little bit and see whether that was the case or whether it was simply just a reaction to what was happening around him. But people must bear in mind at this stage that a human reaction is bound to take place of a form of resentment. While it wasn't Wilde's fault, when you're in that situation, it is hard not to see that. It must be seen that a small sense of resentment could have been held. Could have been are the key words here. We can never know whether this was true or false. We can only take it as an anthropological sensation and a human reaction to an event which took place. Alongside this, another issue crept up, and that was that this officer reshuffle happened literally a day before the maiden voyage. We have Blair leaving with a key in his pocket, but there is a bigger issue at hand which has caused a lot of eyewitness testimonies not to add up. Due to the rapidness of the officer reshuffle happening, the uniforms did not have time to get changed. So Wilde, of course, had his chief officer uniform from the Olympic, and this would not have changed when it got to the Titanic. However, we then had the issue of Murdoch, and Murdoch would have had the chief officer uniform, and he still would have had to wear it on the maiden voyage. Alongside this, Lightoller would have had the first officer uniform and would have had to wear it on the maiden voyage. A lot of eyewitness testimonies did say that they got the officers mixed up. This was due to the uniform being incorrect. One of the last known photos to have taken of Lightoller and Murdoch together was the closing of the door for the pneumatic. In this photo, you can clearly see that Lightoller has the stripes of the first officer, and these stripes were on the cuff of the sleeve, and the cuff of the sleeve is visible in the photograph. Murdoch's is not as visible, but we can presume that he would have had on the same uniform. There was zero time to change, so when it came to the disaster happening and eyewitness accounts of officers doing certain things, we can never be sure which officer it was. So eyewitness accounts which maybe just said chief officer or first officer, we do not know whether those were the correct people. As a historian, this makes our life very difficult. Therefore, we can never know what happened truly with those officers who perished in the disaster due to the officer reshuffle. One simple event set off a string of events after it. The officer reshuffle proves to be one of the biggest turning points in the maiden voyage of the Titanic. It resulted in not only having no binoculars, it also gave us some potential resentment between the officers, and it gave us almost false testimonies of what happened on that fateful night. So on the night of the 9th of April 1912, we finally have our officers sorted for the maiden voyage. We are going to quickly recap on who those are and the positions they held, and then next episode we are going to start looking at the officers as we make all of our stops along the way to go to New York. And of course, as we know, we didn't make it to New York, but we are going to look at those stops before we set off into the Atlantic. So on the 9th of April 1912, we have Captain E.J. Smith, Chief Officer Henry Tingle Wilde, First Officer William McMaster Murdoch, Second Officer Charles Herbert Lightoller, Third Officer Pittman, Fourth Officer Boxall, Fifth Officer Lowe, and Sixth Officer Moody. These are the officers which will take us through the disaster of the Titanic. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one when we start to look at the stops that the Titanic had and the stories of the officers which took place there.